So just to go over what we're going to talk through today, I'm going to talk through a little bit behind scanning and the information that we have that's available to us on scanning, some failure points that we see across lifeguards particularly. We're going to talk about the Model Aquatic Health Code. So if that's a newer idea to you and you're not even sure what that acronym means, we'll talk a little bit about what the MAHC is and what some of the aligned expectations are as it relates to scanning and documentation and audits. So we'll get to that part there. And there's often some questions about where to find additional resources related to the MAHC. And at that point, we will be able to send you some of that extra information. We'll talk a little bit about scanning skills and training methods. And then we'll also talk about audits and how that kind of ties in with these concepts that we're talking through and the documentation around some best practices. So this webinar is hosted by HydroReps, and as part of that, of course, the documentation piece will come in at the end just to kind of tie things up in a bow and help us as operators figure out how we can be kind of checking all those boxes for a variety of different reasons. So just a quick little intro. I love sessions that like really get into the meat of the topic. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time giving you my story, but the one thing I want you to know is that I have been a operator. So I worked in the industry for about 20 years through a variety of part-time and then 12 years of full-time work through a municipality. And I've worked at a YMCA, I've worked at a summer camp. I have worked at a municipality, like I mentioned, and although I now work for HydroReps, I really think it's important that this is rooted in the idea that I understand the challenges that operators are up against when it comes to being able to do all the things. And I know that some of these things will feel like extra layers or extra asks of you when you already feel pretty tapped out. So I just want to ground this conversation in that sense of understanding that I do know some of those battles that you're up against, and I can certainly relate. Okay, so jumping in, why does all of this matter? So the real piece that I want to talk about today is kind of some of the ideas behind the things that we're not really explicitly trained on as far as scanning and recognition pieces, and then also audits. So myself, I am certified as a instructor and an instructor trainer in American Red Cross, and for a while when I started to go to different conferences as a younger professional in aquatics, I knew what words like scanning and audits meant, but I didn't know how to actually take them and implement them. And so I noticed that a lot of the stuff that was being presented was either a little bit beyond what my capacity was because I wasn't already using some type of structure, or it wasn't kind of basic enough where it could help me get started. So because of that, we'll interlace some information in here, and hopefully wherever you are in your journey with these concepts, you'll have additional resources to be able to go back and learn about them. So this conversation matters for us because scanning is a really essential part of lifeguarding, and it's not something that's explicitly trained or explicitly observed all the time. And when failures happen with scanning, our industry tends to really blame individuals or agencies for the really industry lack of conversation around scanning. So as we talk today, we'll kind of implement some different things, and I'll give you some different resources for where I've pulled some of these concepts as well. And then the favorite part, I think that all of us have, a lot of us love to do this work because it's rooted in training and coaching staff, and we're able to supervise our team and help them be successful both on the deck or at the waterfront, but then also beyond that in leadership and in their ability to be able to take those skills and translate them somewhere else. So because all of that matters, it kind of ties in together, and that will be our conversation today. So just to start us off, a lot of the information that I have about the topics that I'll talk through today, as far as best practices or concepts, are from AJARI. So the International Journal of Aquatic Research and Education has some studies that have been done in a variety of different ways, and a lot of the information that I've pulled in that is stating something as kind of a truth is from that resource and from different pieces of articles and research that has been put on that website. So I will send that information out. If you've never heard of this before, I don't think you're necessarily alone in that. If you've never opened a research paper and read through it, you're also not alone. I think this is another gap in our industry where those of us that are operators, I have a background in leisure studies. So my undergrad degree is in leisure studies and recreation management, sport management. A lot of us are in that category where we're not really familiar with a lot of academia and things like that. And that's completely normal. But that is where a lot of the information that I'll talk through will come from. And then I'll provide that resource for you as well and that reference. So why do guards miss things even when they're trying, right? No guard is actually intentionally trying to miss what's going on in the process of scanning. But we do know that human attention degrades as it's designed to. Essentially, like our brains are designed in that way where they're moving us in different directions. Our brain is refocusing us in different directions. And it's also true that stress alters our perception of what we're seeing, but also it can also alter our focus in general. Everyone's level for focus and attention is going to vary, but it's important to know that part of our brain's job as being really binary is to assign assumption and to assign gaps in what it is that we're seeing or witnessing. And this can be because of our own backstory and our own lived experiences. Some of you know me from my DEI work, where we talk a lot about how the brain is binary and it's prescribing value or things as being safe or unsafe really readily and easily, and that's a superpower that our brain has. But because of that, it means that misses can happen when we're in the guard chair and when our attention is supposed to be focused on what it is that we're viewing. Usually, the opportunity to miss what's going on isn't just an individual's lack of perception of what's going on in their specific problem. And so I do want to emphasize that because I think that we tend to also, as operators, think like that can't happen to me or that wouldn't happen to me. And I think that's some dangerous thinking that we want to try to move away from and try to think about more critically as a community. So a few things about scanning science in general. As a human, you can anticipate that the person who's in a guard chair is going to have a limited ability to stay super focused in the guard chair. And over time, their attention and attention to detail and their ability to stay mentally active will decline. Vigilance will drop after short periods without any variation happening that keeps their brain kind of attentive to what's going on. And I'll talk a little bit about what some of that is. Stress narrows our attention, and this is called visual tunneling or cognitive tunneling. And what happens when a guard is in a chair and they're having visual tunneling is that their brain is sorting out anything that seems benign so that they can focus on kind of this big scary event that they're looking for. And what that can what can happen and what that can do to guards in a chair is that it can mean that they filter out, or we filter out if we're in the chair, things that are small that are potentially also important that we might not be recognizing. So why are we talking about this stuff in general? Well, I think the more we can talk about these things, the more we can also translate this to our staff and make sure that they know what these concepts are and a little bit of kind of the pop psychology behind some of this stuff, but then we also can train to it as well. And when they are hemming and hawing about certain types of training, because it doesn't feel as exciting or sexy maybe as doing compressions and some other stuff, we can really ground this, and this is why we focus on this. Stress also can slow down decision making and problem solving. So if you've ever seen around Halloween, there was a bunch of viral videos of people running and trying to open a door before someone that was like following them in with like a Grim Reaper mask. And the idea is meant to be like a funny, like you're under pressure trying to open the door that's locked with a key. But the idea is real, right? When we're under stress, we look at that and we think, oh, that's so easy to just unlock a door that they've probably gone into 100 times, a key that they've probably used 100 times. But when they're actually under the stress of trying to do it, it's so much more difficult. And decision making and problem solving is like that too. I regularly do demos for our HydroApps product. And when I'm trying to find something, it's always so much harder when someone's watching me try to find something and try to troubleshoot. And this is just, again, the nature of stress, the nature of the brain. So it's important that people know that, because If they don't know that that's typical or that's a assumed response, then people start to think something's wrong with them. And we as an industry start to also think that something's wrong with people who are acting differently than what is typical. And then that creates a whole lot of other issues that we can potentially have in the industry, like staff having, really traumatic responses to things that they should expect to happen at the pool or at the waterfront. There's often a verification gap. So what this means when it comes to scanning is that we tend to think as guards that we've completed a successful scanning cycle. So we think that we've done it, and supervisors believe that we've done it. And then documentation doesn't necessarily show that anybody has done it. And then it just kind of reiterates this idea that scanning isn't something that we really are training on or testing or measuring in any way. And this is where we start to get into a little bit of trouble because we know how preventative scanning is, and it's obviously a really important part of the structure overall. There is risk in this idea of false completion, of everybody feeling like a successful scan has taken place and every layer of the agency kind of buying into that. We tend to think that something is done because we're able to move on to the next thing. And I'll talk here in a few minutes about some of the things we can think about. But the elephant in the room is that oftentimes when we have fatalities in guarded facilities, it's because they have slipped under the water and they haven't been recognized, and our staff has had a gap between addressing potentially someone being an active victim, or maybe they've moved right into a passive state and they haven't been identified. And then they get identified at some point in that cycle, but not necessarily through the scanning cycle. And so because of that, we know, and from some of the research that I was looking at before in my effort to create this presentation, we know that bottom checks are commonly skipped when there's interruptions, but just in general, we know that this isn't something that is yet really highly emphasized in the industry. And it's important that we're aware of that. And it's something that we're overemphasizing, hopefully with our team. There is obviously the potential for us to overcorrect and go in the wrong direction and explicitly be bottom checking. So if you've ever been to a water park and you've seen guards be really vigilantly checking doing bottom checks, so much so that they're missing the top surface of the water, that might be an overcorrection where we're not doing a full scan or a complete scan and we're not checking all parts of the water. We're really overcorrecting and only emphasizing that bottom piece. But some people do emphasize that because the different types of data that we have do suggest that that's where fatalities and serious injuries are happening. And so that's kind of the area that needs the most attention. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about stress, cognition, and time distortion. So we already talked about the brain a little bit on stress. If you're really interested in more information around the brain, I do recommend that you check out what the International Lifeguard Critical Incident Response Alliance is doing in partnership with AOAP to bring resilience first aid to the industry. There's a lot of information in there. And I, alongside Ilsera, also offer some de-escalation training, and we talk quite a bit about the brain in there as well. But the brain under stress, time is warped. So it's distorted. We feel like it either can be compressed or it can go faster. And because of that, we can think that we've done a complete scan of our zone, but maybe we've missed some things, or we just haven't done the entirety of it. Any type of cognitive load that creates stress on the brain also can cue us to miss different things in that whole entire scanning process. And this doesn't, like it says on the slide, this doesn't have to do with someone's attitude or effort, right? It doesn't mean that someone's intending to be an underperforming guard or is intending to be distracted or kind of pulled from their assumed responsibilities. It's just part of what we can expect to happen. So our job then becomes, how do we solve for this problem knowing that it exists, instead of just hoping that it doesn't kind of find us wherever we are in our process. Just an example here: after a whistle blast or a rule confrontation takes place, a guard resumes their scanning, believing that they completed the prior full cycle of the scan when they actually might have not come to completion. But our brain will tell us that we potentially did complete that scan of the zone. And so then we start over again, and there might be something that we have missed, like a person at the bottom of the pool on the second part that of the scan that we missed the first time. And then our brain is just going to do its work to convince us that everything is fine, because that is part of the brain's process as well, is we're having people look for things that are very rarely wrong, and the brain can have a difficult time doing that in general. And there are some different studies around that as well. So just something to be in mind. Stress doesn't just cause lifeguards to be distracted. It also can change the completion of the task. It can increase risk, and it also can change their perception of time, which is a really important thing to be including when you're talking to your team about what's appropriate behavior when they're on a chair or they're in their zone and they're scanning. Despite all of us really emphasizing that the team shouldn't be distracted and things along those lines, it often can happen. But if we can root it back to what happens when we're distracted and why it's such a big risk, that often can help with behavioral change and change management at your location. So I'm not going to go over a ton of detail about what drowning looks like, but I think it's important that you all have some resources that you share back with your team. You obviously have your certification program, but just knowing that it can be silent, there can be minimal splashing. I heard a lot about the invisible ladder when I was a younger professional, and I didn't really know what that was. But the idea is that people can look like they're kind of climbing a ladder in the water with their hands reaching out and their legs trying to grab at a rung. This might be really straightforward for some of you to imagine that, but my neurodivergent brain is a little bit, sometimes the more obvious to others, the less obvious to me. So if that's a new concept to you, we do hear about that quite a bit in aquatics, and that's the idea, is that someone's trying to grab at some invisible rungs on a ladder, and it can be small or big movements, but just a heads up that that's what that is. I think one of the things I like to emphasize is that body position in the water can really vary. So people aren't just on the top or just on the bottom. They can be in the middle of the water. They don't always look like just kind of laid out in a straight line. They can be in fetal position. They can be really distorted shape-wise from the top of the water that we're viewing. And obviously we know about distortion from certification programs with glare and lighting and things along those lines. But if you're not already doing some work with your team to talk to them and to show them what different objects and different bodies, specifically real human bodies, look like in different parts of the zones of your locations, of your facilities, and then also what that looks like from different parts of the zone, that's really helpful. And if that's one of the main things that you take from this, I think that's a really great takeaway to bring back and to do during an in-service training. So just a reminder, drowning doesn't always look like panic. It can look like struggle and fatigue. It also can look like nothing. We can miss all of it and someone's just at the bottom of the body of water. So it's important that staff's aware of that as well. So the elephant in the room that we talked about, why guards miss bottom victims. We've talked about visual tunneling. And the big thing here is that our industry tends to focus on surface activity. And that makes a lot of sense because that's where there's noise, that's where there's movement, that's where there's splashing, that's where people are at, right? They're coming up for breath if they are underwater. And so our attention span tends to go there because a lot of what we're doing is rule enforcement, and it's also policy enforcement. So we're trying to get people's heads above water to have those conversations if something's going on that's inconsistent with what they should be doing. Poor water clarity or glare are important factors. There's regularly every year here in the United States stories about people not being able to see the bottom of the water or the bottom of a pool, and that being a contributing factor. So just being really aware of that. If you're having difficulty kind of grounding that with your staff about why it's so important for them to be testing water and for them to be making adjustments to the water chemistry and things like that, that can really land that. Static scanning patterns, so having really dogmatic ideas around how you're supposed to scan that might be taking people away from the actual active scanning and instead like really prescribing to them certain shapes and things like that. Fatigue, distraction, not receiving structured feedback or auditing on scanning. is definitely a contributor. Motion bias towards the surface. So I already talked a little bit about our focus goes to the surface, but a motion bias is our eyes. Assuming that we have full vision, our eyes follow what is moving. And so because of that, we are going to be responsive visually, regardless of what we're doing, if we're guarding and scanning, or if we are just kind of in our office and we hear something that brings us our focus to that. So that's important for our team to know as well. Stationary targets blend into the background. Nothing happening is our brain's way of kind of protecting us from something that could be dangerous that's happening. But because of that, that also can help us convince ourselves that we're not seeing what we think we do, and then we can move on to the next part of our scan and miss some of those items. So one of the things that I do want you to leave with our conversation today with is that we know that there is predictability behind what it is that we're talking about here, where bottom checks need to be observed and then they need to be documented. And so that should be a part of your process when it comes to making sure that's documented in your training, any pre-service that you do, and I'll talk about that in a moment with the Model Aquatic Health Code, any type of audits that you do, making sure that you're documenting that you are doing these parts of the checks is really important, because experience doesn't negate or eliminate the bias that we might miss the bottom of the pool. And that's important to know, because some of the studies that I've looked through and that I will link back to as well when we send out that information to you, is that there are some instances where we hear stories where a lifeguard is alerted to someone being on the bottom of a body of water or bottom of a pool, or we've all seen videos, unfortunately, of people swimming on top of somebody else and then a lifeguard being alerted afterwards. So we also need to make sure that the public knows that that's part of what we're looking for, is the people on the bottom of the pool, and they can assist us with that because they too have the ability to see what's going on, and we know that they are letting us know, and they're looping us into situations that maybe our team are not noticing. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit now that I've talked a little bit about scanning. So the Model Aquatic Health Code is a set of best practices that are developed in conjunction with the industry, and there is a group of people that come together and meet about the best practices and kind of the rules, and it serves as more of a state or a countrywide code, if you will. So if every state has its own health code and its own operating code for pools and splash pads, then the MAHC is really designed to try to unify a lot of that, because there's a lot of reasons why code might not be up to date in different states, and every state also really varies. So I live in Iowa. Our code in Iowa is different than like Florida's code, for example, and that's for good reason in some ways. We have very different populations. We're different in density. We're different in bodies of water in our states by location of natural bodies of water in the actual state, but then around the state as well. So it makes sense that there's a little bit of a difference, but the MAHC is designed to kind of align all of us with these best practices. And when there are instances where people are acting outside of these best practices, it does serve as a reference that people refer back to and ask different operations and different agencies, why are you not using your state code, obviously, but then also the Model Aquatic Health Code. And so it's important that every operator knows what this is, and as much as possible tries to do the items in the code to their best of their ability, as these best practices really do serve as kind of that benchmark. So what does the MAHC emphasize when it comes to these topics of vigilance and scanning and auditing? So the MAHC emphasizes that every agency has defined zones of responsibility, that active purposeful scanning is happening and is documented, that guards are in a rotation and they are offered down periods from that rotation, not necessarily breaks in the traditional sense of like employment law, but breaks in the idea of they are in a rotation, they'll have time that they're actively scanning the water, water, and then they'll have times where they are down from actively scanning the water, and they might have other duties as assigned. So they might be in the first aid office, they might be walking the locker rooms, they might be in the pump room, whatever that might look like for your operation. There's supervisor oversight and evaluation. So it doesn't explicitly spell out what that exactly looks like, but we know that it's in there. And then scanning must be trained, evaluated, and documented. So that means that we do need to have in-service agendas that have scanning in the actual content of the training and activities related to scanning. And we need to have some way to evaluate that we are looking and watching and measuring scanning in some type of capacity. And then we of course, document it, right? If we don't document it, did it even happen? When it comes to training expectations, it's a little bit more spelled out for us. We know that the MAHC recommends that a pre-service training is done. And this is a time where you would have someone come in and they would need to complete these bullets before they would ever get in the stand. And what you would be looking for in this pre-service training would be scanning mechanics and pattern, recognition, that an approved recognition. So you've tested recognition of distress swimmers, zone coverage and positioning. So this could look like a tour. This could look like a tour with a quiz of testing them on each of the zones. Certainly would look like showing them different photos of all of the different ways that you could have the pool set up with different guard chairs or guard locations, and how that would change based on maybe the activity. It could be different if you have swim team versus open swim. It also could include zone coverage based on staffing. So all of us have had staffing issues. So how does the zone coverage and the rotation change when we're more busy, when we're less busy, when someone calls out, which we know will happen at some point. And then also stress exposure and exposure to realistic drills. So how are you drilling them on actual practices at the locations? And so this does mean that you need to make sure that everyone is having actual training at their facility that they're going to be working at, even if you have 15 locations. That means that they need to be doing some training at every location, and they need to be familiar with the zone of coverage and the rotations at all of those locations. So if you have less than that, it makes it a little bit easier, but obviously everyone has different resources. So you just have to keep this in mind as you are doing training. For ongoing training, so in-service trainings are ongoing trainings, and they should include live scanning drills, scenario-based practice, surprise variables. So this is when they're actually suggesting that we add in some additional things that are going to hopefully get them to be critically thinking, to be doing problem solving, kind of all of these soft skills that are really, really, really important for just being a functional human being. But things like empathy and communication and being able to work through a problem and being able to have that compassion and being able to have good decision making and good teamwork under stress and other factors. There needs to be feedback and correction. So we all inherently know this, but making sure that we actually are also documenting any corrective action that we take, and then documentation of performance. So how is everybody actually doing when we're going through these trainings? So model aquatic health code expectations on deck look like defined zones, so clear visual boundaries, making sure that you also have accompanying visual guides to that. So you should have, just like you should have EAPs printed out, you should have your zones of coverage printed out. What's a little bit difficult about some of this is that, state code knows to be asking about some of this stuff, but they're not as specialized in aquatics. And that's what's really cool about the MAHC, is that it is designed and reviewed by aquatic professionals in all different types of areas in the field. And so they're really bringing up to the surface things that are very specific to us in our industry. There should be active scanning on deck, so visual head movement and depth checks. There should be supervisor oversight, so a manager on deck, not just somebody in an office, but an actual manager on deck who is doing short but frequent observation windows. And this person should be a coach. This should be somebody that's able to give corrective feedback. They're able to give technical feedback. They're able to coach the team. And really, if you've gone to any of my other sessions, you know that I love to talk about realistic first aid, but I also like to talk about how all of this stuff shouldn't be punitive, because we don't want it to be be something where people start to have stress about being good. There's a difference between eustress, good stress, and starting to shut down and feeling like they're going to kind of have got you moments. We don't want those got you moments. We want coaching moments. We want learning moments. We want those moments where they're really going to be able to stretch into the skill. So training is a loop. It's not a one-time event. When it comes to scanning, and in a moment here, we're going to talk about audits, we want to make sure that we're teaching the actual skill. So getting really granular of what it is that we're talking about. So what are the mechanics of scanning? What happens with your head? What happens with your vision? What happens when you can't see an area? What happens when you're at one of the locations that kind of has a unique shape to it? We all have seen facilities where we're like, who designed this? Clearly not someone who's thinking about watching water, right? Because of the shapes and the different features in the way and the barriers and the blocks of line of supervision and things like that. But have those conversations and then talk about expectations. When you and supervisors and coworkers and peers walk on deck, what is it that you're looking for as far as expectation for scanning of the skill, but really all the other skills as well. You want to stress the skill. So a stress test is good to put on any type of skill. Trainings end up being really sterile environments because everybody knows that something's going to happen. Everybody knows that we're at a training. So you're able to add within reason additional distractions and surprise elements and fatigue. You can make them practice CPR for 10 minutes. You can make them sit in a chair for a long time. But you also really want to make sure that you're stressing the skill. So it's not just the baseline of the skill, but it's also much more relevant to what's realistically going to happen in that type of environment. There's going to be a lot of noise. There's going to be a lot of confusion. There's going to be somebody that potentially does freeze that maybe you would have relied on for helping you with different skills and things like that. So not only talking through that, but trying to replicate that is really important. Observation of the skill we talked through, short real-time audits focus on visible behavior that can be documented. I'll give us some tips about how to document this in a moment, but it's also important that we're observing it and then we document it, and we're focused on behavior-based language, not quantifying it as someone doing a good job or a great job. When I was an operator, when we would do training for our lifeguard instructors, we would always talk about how to give feedback in a way that removes this idea of just saying good job or nice job. So it's like, what can you actually give feedback on? You can give feedback on how technically accurate it is. You can give feedback on how expeditious it is. You can give feedback on soft skills, like observing empathy, observing communication, etc. But just saying good doesn't necessarily bring the level of feedback to the point that it needs to be at. And it's certainly not language that you want to include in documentation. We want to be using neutral language, just like we would if we were reporting on an incident, but we also want to make sure that we're focusing on the behavior that we're observing. And then coach. Everything is a work in progress, and, ripping off the Band-Aid and doing some of this stuff for the first time, you're definitely gonna uncover some stuff under those rocks that we were like, whoa, this is not exactly what I expected, but in some ways your team will surprise you in positive ways as well. So just be aware that you're constantly going to be providing feedback. I think one of the coolest things about young adults is that their jobs, if they're going into the job force under the age of like 22 or so, is all of the jobs, not all of them, but a lot of them are so heavily based in feedback. And what's neat about our industry is that we don't even really have a learning curve to give them corrective feedback, because aquatics is already so much based on technicality. With how you teach someone to swim, you're giving them corrective feedback. How you coach someone on the swim team, corrective feedback. And then it also plays into their lifeguarding skills. And then from there, we can coach them on additional things like those soft skills. So we have such a great advantage. We just need to keep leaning into that muscle. So just to wrap up a couple things about scanning, and then we'll transition here. Effective scanning requires your team to, whoever's on the stand or roving, whatever your setup looks like, actively searching their entire zone, continuing assessing risk, depth, and movement, recognizing subtle signs of distress, and then resetting their scanning after interruption. So instead of just thinking, oh, I've done the entirety of that rotation, I'm going to go back to I'm going to start from here and think I continue on. They'll go back to the beginning and reset and just mentally have a reset. Effective scanning visually looks like intentional head movement, not just eye movement. So you're moving for different fields of view. You're not just shifting your eyes. This is something that's really straightforward to be able to evaluate when you're looking at somebody and observing them. Surface to bottom coverage, near to far visual progression. So near to far is going to be closest to them, and then to the farthest edge out of their zone of coverage in a consistent way. Making sure that there's variation and that there's intentional resets after any distraction. So if they're distracted, they're deliberately moving back and restarting their search instead of picking up where they've left things off. If we follow this type of rubric, scanning is visible and it can be verifiable that we're able to measure some of these things that we're looking for. We've talked a little bit about how we train to this, but scanning drills, we know the MAHC wants us to include those. Having distraction layering, so knowing that there needs to be a recovery phase after interruption. Doing any type of timed bottom object detection, and this can be anything from an object at the bottom. There's objects on the market that we can buy that will also help us measure how long it takes to get to different parts of the zones. That can be all the way up to some type of more expanded upon audit in the form of like a mystery shopper where you're having someone go in, but essentially some type of mechanism that's helping you reinforce bottom scanning. And then simulating realistic situations like fatigue, like time distortion, like stress, and like tiredness. If you have lots of college students and young adults who are working for you, they might also be athletes. They're all taking a million AP classes, it seems like, so they're tired. So how do you simulate some of that? Okay, we're going to shift gears here and talk a little bit about audits. I'm going to present a handful of audits that are in line with what we offer through our HydroApp software. There are lots of different ways to do audits. And so if you're someone who's new or your organization's new to audits, or more realistically, you know what audits are, you have an audit form at your location, and you have more of an issue with the follow through on the audits. And what I mean by that is you either are struggling because an audit form will come in and then you'll not be able to coach as timely or as holistically as you want, or you have the issue of you have audits, but you just run out of time and it's a delegation piece, or maybe you don't have the right people in play or the right positions that people can help facilitate some of the audits. We'll tackle that as well. So audits, first and foremost, are coaching tools. I'm really anti making audits be performative in any way. They should be identifying trends, not just individual errors. And so if you're using digital documentation, you're able to pull up different data that might show you, what percentage of people being audited in the month of January are, failing an audit potentially, or are missing a certain step in the audit. And any digital documentation software should have ways for you to pull aggregate data, so that way you're not just replicating a Excel document where you're putting stuff into a website portal, but it's also helping you identify things like trends in your audits, which then will inform what you're doing for training. They should be supported by accountability and consistency, and they should be designed to protect staff and the organization. So again, this isn't a got you moment. This is measuring that we're doing what we should be doing, and this should provide you all as operators also hopefully a sense of I don't want to say relief, because I don't think that ever happens, but a sense of assurance that the onboarding, the pre-training, the training, the audits, all of this stuff works together to keep patrons safe at your facilities. So I mentioned we'll talk through 5 types of audits. I'm going to talk through the internal observation audit first. This generally, I think, is called more in the industry a quick check. So the idea of an internal observation is that you're going to grab a quick snapshot of a lifeguard performance, and it's during normal operation. So the idea would be that they're in their stand or they're in their roving position, wherever they're supposed to be in the rotation, and someone's going to capture any observable behaviors. That can include scanning, the position that they're in, so body position, the way that they're kind of rescue ready. I'm using air quotes, you just can't see me use them. Rule enforcement, policy enforcement, and then you're also going to capture environmental context. Environmental context is important because the different things factor into different situations. And so we can know if it's a really busy time, if there's a lot going on for surface kind of input, if it's really busy, if it's really loud. Is it really boring? Is there some lessons going on, but it's private lessons and there's 10 people total in the pool? Is it the end of the shift? Is it the beginning of the shift? What's going on in the zone specifically? What's going on for weather if you're outside, and so on. These matter because they make your expectations really clear, and it's very clear when you're essentially testing someone of what you're looking for when you go through this process. It also allows for instant coaching, which we love. I am a big fan of the concept where anytime you give someone a ounce of feedback that they should have, and they should be able to implement that right away. So in a training, that's going to look like, hey, Joey, make sure your compressions are this deep when you are giving those, or hey, Tyler, ventilations are supposed to be this long, and then you give them the opportunity to reset and do it again. The same would be true for this. It's during a shift, they're going to get back in the stand after they come down and chat with you and kind of have their down period, and then get back up, and that is timely coaching that's implementable. I don't think that's a word, but you can do it right away. And then this is also going to be something that you document. So this is documentation of active supervision and active auditing. This is really important when someone asks you, if you have an incident in your facility, what have you done to train your team? And you're able to pull up a series of documents where you show that you did this many audits with Maria, and Lori attended this many trainings, and so on. So that's a really important first piece. So what is this best for? So these are best for day-to-day coaching, reinforcement of skills. So that's why you're thinking about this when it comes to what you're doing on a daily basis. Creating consistency across supervisors. This helps a lot with expectation and policy. And then risk management, obviously proving that you're doing what you're supposed to do. This can also be really helpful to communicate this to your higher ups, that this is part of why you have layers of leadership. You need head guards, you need pool coordinators and managers, because they help do these types of things. They keep the facility safe. Tips for effective use. Observations can lean more on the short side. There are instances of why you should do a longer one. So it doesn't have to be 20 to 60 seconds, but they can be. So if you have a high quantity, you definitely can be doing many of these, but you want to make sure you're documenting behaviors, match written comments to your observed actions. And the concept here is, if it can't be seen, it can't be coached or documented. So you're looking for things that you actually can see. You can see over here, this form kind of just shows you that you can break down where they're at in the rotation and in the facility, what zone they're in. You can add in short little video clips. I think that video clips are really great for something like this, because if you're trying to teach them that scanning is a physical behavior and a mental behavior, it's cognitive and it's physical, then you want to be able to show them the physical part of it, because they might feel like they're doing a really adequate job at scanning. And a lot of us have our own perception issues with being able to know how strong or how complete we're doing something. So being able to see that video can really be helpful. And then some other stuff here. So this is additional quick check related things. Being in uniform, having all parts of your uniform, posture, and so on. And there's some other things that you can certainly be checking here as well. Okay, so the second kind is an internal skill evaluation. So this one is an assessment of their rescue and their response using a defined scenario, but testing for specific skills. So there's a few different ways that people break this down. In the HydroOps software, ours is more of a scenario-based assessment. When I was an operator, my skill observation was a checklist. So I used the checklist in the back of the book from the Red Cross, and every quarter, every single person in a small group went through and showed us they could do every single one of the skills, and it was separate. So it wasn't designed to be scenario practice. It was designed to make sure, can you get to the actual bottom of the pool, not just 7 to 10 feet. Our pools are, unless your pool is only 7 to 10 feet. But otherwise, you should have documentation that everybody on your team can get something from the deepest part of your facility. Otherwise, how do you know that they can when they really need to? Adrenaline is fantastic, but how do we make sure that every single person in the chair gets all the way to the bottom? Because if we only practice that a couple minutes out of every in-service, out of every month, assuming we're doing our 4 hours like we're supposed to every month, it still doesn't mean that I've actually checked off that every single person can do that specific skill. So that's definitely one way to do it. This way with the scenarios is really designed, again, to be looking at technical rescue skills. People can hide in services and not do all of the skills. They also can volunteer for the stuff that they feel best at. I know this firsthand because I was a lifeguard and I used to do that. And I talk pretty openly about what I know now as I feel like a grown up, even though I was a grown up in many of the years that I was a lifeguard. I was an adult. But they definitely can find ways around just kind of demonstrating that they can do every single skill. So this helps you capture that. It's also going to measure some other stuff that isn't always measurable: EAP activation, communication, decision making under any type of realistic or simulated stress. You'll be able to talk through the context and the performance outcome of the scenario. And this matters because it confirms that they can do the skills, not just that they're certified, not just that they did them at in-service or at pre-service, but you're checking in periodically and checking off on that skill again. It also identifies any needs for coaching, and it helps you create contingency plans for anyone who needs additional coaching. As you start to do audits, I absolutely recommend that you already build in some additional coaching structure into your training schedule. That could be like you make someone attend an additional option of in-service, or it could be like a lifeguard instructor goes and hosts, 2 different drop-in options each month. And then that would be some of the remedial expectation, is that they would go and attend those and you would log that. Again, any remediation needs to be documented, so you would document that. And then competency and readiness, 2 very unsexy words, but really important words for lifeguards. So what does this look like in use? It is going to be a return to duty and readiness check, ongoing in-service skill validation or ongoing validation outside of in-service training, consistency across rescue types. It's effective for clearly defined scenarios. You're observing observational actions, not just how quickly it can be done or that it has been done. And then again, documentation. So skills aren't proven in theory. We actually are going to have them perform them for us, so we know what they're capable of doing, and then give them additional coaching based on that. Okay, the third one, this is probably the most common one, or the one we think about when we think of audits, the live recognition drill. So time-based in water assessment, generally in water assessment, there is some water component to it that evaluates a guard's ability to detect and respond to a submerged or distressed target. Generally speaking, they don't know that it's happening, so we're doing like a drop drill. Some of the more kind of historic ways this have been done have been with like a ball drill or a shadow on the bottom of the pool. There's a lot of benefit to using different pieces of equipment for different reasons and changing up what you use. There's also a lot of benefit to using real people in these scenarios. One of the studies that I read in Ajare talked about how there is a change to patron behavior after they watch a drill of some kind, and they become less risk-taking as a result of watching a scenario play out or watching some type of recognition drill or some type of audit. And I think that's really powerful. There used to be kind of this idea that we didn't do this in real time because we didn't want to scare patrons, but we also didn't want to catch them we didn't want to have them catch us doing something wrong, and we know how kind of contested that can be. But there is a lot of benefit to building in some type of audit in the public space, and regardless of what you're using for actual equipment. What we're looking to capture here is recognition, speed, accuracy, bottom scanning. So a lot of times this is going to be something or someone who's at the bottom. Visual tracking, that depth awareness. the environmental load again. So what's going on as far as busyness, weather, all of these kind of layers of distraction, what's happening in the zone, etc. And then we're directly testing the skills that are most often missed by incidents. We're identifying bottom bias. We're trying to really confirm how effective their scanning is. Are they able to recognize when something isn't typical for whatever reason, because it's an active, because it's an object at the bottom of the pool, and they're acting effectively as a result? This is best for validating bottom scanning effectiveness, identifying recognition delays before real emergencies happen. So being able to measure your team's ability on an individual basis to respond to this. Sometimes it is a team effort as well, because you might have someone in a different zone recognized, and then that also kind of supports the team culture, but it also helps you figure out zones and making sure that people are aware of where they're responsible and kind of coaching them on that. It also provides an opportunity for time-based documentation. You can use people, which is my recommendation, but you also can use objects. And there's a lot of reason to use different types of objects for different types of things. There are some things that will live on the bottom. There's some things that'll float. So, and there's definitely benefit in variety. And then from here you can run drills during different activities. So that's also really important. We tend to forget that so much can change when we have different things going on, from like an adult mid-morning lap swim where it's really kind of quiet and no one even wants to have music playing, until it's like swim lessons plus lap swim plus the swim team, plus like all the whole building's busy and things like that. So just being aware of that. The idea here is recognition speed is a scanning outcome, not a reaction test. So lots of record keeping again here, and you can see this has how long it took, what the test object is, and then the results for this. And then also you can take pictures of the zone chart and the zone. So two more here, zone testing. So zone testing is validation that your team, so this isn't from a facility standpoint of doing zone testing, although zone validation is something that you also should do. That's separate of this. So what this specifically is, are we're testing that our guards know what their zones is, and they're able to recognize, respond, and get to an emergency in their assigned zone. This can help validate when we set up zones at our facility, but it's also something that we want to be doing on an ongoing basis as well, because we constantly have new people in our organization that we want to be able to get to all the parts of their zone, the deepest, furthest, hardest to see parts of their zone. So we're looking to capture response within their zone of responsibility. And then again, we're looking for EAP activation, how they're able to get through the environment, and how they deal with maybe a busier zone, or what do they do when there's a whibbit in the zone, or there's lane lines, and like all types of different things that are realistically going to be there. We don't want to be thinking about these things for the first time when they're really happening, because we know from our brain's perspective that that's going to cause us to maybe like go into freeze or kind of fight or flight. But the other piece is that it can create more trauma for guards again if they don't know to expect some of these things. They shouldn't be encountering, as young adults, some of them are not young adults, but as a person, they shouldn't be encountering something for the first time when it's happening as an emergency situation. We should be prepping them as much as possible. Extrication and initial care timing. And then this matters because it confirms guards can operate effectively within real zone constraints, which is why it does help us with zone validation. It identifies any delays that could be caused by the layout, the patron load, or access points, entry or exit points. And then it tests the full response sequence, not just recognition. So here you can see this shows readiness. This documentation again supports this idea. You can test high risk or complex areas. You can run tests during realistic patron loads, and you can make sure that you are documenting different barriers or delays, especially if you need to be communicating that back to somebody else on your team that might be the ultimate decision maker about some of these things, and you need to provide them with some data to show them that there might be some problems with environmental barriers or your breather load maximums and things like that. So the last one here is external audits. So some certification agencies, these are mandated. Sometimes they're an add-on, but the idea is that you're evaluated by a third party. This can be from your certification agency. It also can be from someone who is a consultant of some kind. But the idea is you have an independent assessment of operations and performance. There is alignment with policies and expectations. There is documentation that the all of the systems have been tested for strengths and any type of gaps that they have, and it helps give you feedback that isn't biased, so you can identify what's going on and where you have some areas to improve. These are best for system level review. So doing this periodically, it can validate what you're already doing. So if you're not already doing some of the stuff that I've talked about, definitely implement some of these things and then look into getting external auditing, because then you've kind of already put all the pieces together. Down here, I mentioned that external audits don't replace internal oversight, and they definitely don't. They do celebrate if you're doing what you should be doing. They give you some things to work towards, but they're definitely just another piece in the puzzle. They're not the only piece. So who runs trainings and audits? Lifeguard instructors can be running skilled trainings depending on how your structure is broken down. This is going to vary for everybody, but generally speaking, supervisors and leads and those kind of middle managers can be working on audits and coaching. Training coordinators want to be overseeing in services. I see a lot of people that offload or outsource training agendas to someone that's not even a middle manager. And I would just recommend that you're making sure that you're covering all the different aspects. They definitely can get a head start on it, but make sure you're the final pass. And then I'm a huge fan of delegation, so I'm not suggesting you don't delegate. You absolutely need to delegate in aquatics to survive, but make sure that you have quality control and you have attention to detail. And then the biggest piece with all of this is follow-up. So if you identify a gap in a person or a system, making sure that you have a plan to follow up. So to just wrap up, I'm going to talk a little bit about documentation. So you need to be recording the date, the time, the location of when you're running trainings and audits. You need to be tracking who's observing it and what observable behaviors you see. And then any coaching feedback that's given and any remedial behaviors that need to happen afterwards. So any follow-up actions need to be documented as well. The language that you use matters. Obviously, from a person-to-person perspective, it's important because we want to be building people up and coaching them. But the big thing that we want to be thinking of is avoiding any language that is kind of negative in nature, and really instead focusing on behavior, like we mentioned in the beginning. So head remains stationary for 45 seconds is a lot better than inattentive, because it also helps us measure this in the future. It's like, okay, I was inattentive. How do I be attentive? If I, instead of using attentive, if I use the behavior, this actually tells me. Bottom scan not observed during interval. This tells me what's the goal is to bottom scan during the interval, and then focused on surface activity only. So just some suggestions about language that you can use. When it comes to documentation, make sure that you're documenting different information that you need for all of these trainings and your audits. But just remember that all of your coaching conversations, all the planning that you do, all the performance evaluations, all of the remedial trainings that you do, all of the things that you do consistently, you want to make sure that you have documentation to go back to and to show. So what do we do with all this information now that we have it? So getting started, if you're brand new to some of these concepts, take one thing that feels like kind of the thing to either bring back into an in-service as a topic, or that you've found as kind of homework. So if you're thinking to yourself, we don't do any scanning drills right now in our training. So then that would be your focus, is to go back, find some scanning drills. I have some suggestions if you need some, but that can be your one piece of homework. If you're not doing any audits right now, or if you have audits but you're not really following up with them, then pick one for right now that you can be working on, and figure out how you can also delegate some of this out for consistency's sake. And then be consistent with documentation. So start small with those things, and then make sure your fortune is in the follow-up. So all of this matters, but it really also matters that you're able to go back and show someone that you've done all of your parts of reducing risk and documenting all of these components for success. If you have been around the block for a while and you're doing a lot of these things and you're kind of shaking your head as you hear them, consider adding in your own internal evaluation where you see what trends you're seeing across audits or across trainings, and then make a plan to address those in additional audits or in trainings. Consider layering stress testing into trainings and audits, and then look into doing some peer audits. So I think there's a saying that you can learn a lot by teaching. And so there is something really wonderful about peer audits and building a culture around peer support in that way. So consider building out some type of peer audit if you are already quite seasoned. And then just a few things to ask of yourself. What scanning behaviors are you expecting? How do you know that that's happening? And then how are you documenting and coaching that it's happening as well? I do have a couple of activities here for you, and we're going to send out the recording and the slides and the workbook, and these will be in that. But there are some different activities you can integrate in to your trainings. So one of them is to do a kind of quiz, either in an audit or in a training form where you have someone actively scanning and then you test them on what it is that they scanned. It's not so important that they're able to remember every single thing, right? We have so many different pieces of input. We don't need to retain all of that, but it's really good to have that conversation afterwards and show them the video of them scanning and show them when you say, how many people in your zone had on a personal flotation device, and they say, oh, two. Then you show them the video and you notice that those two people were like hand over hand on the wall, inching towards deeper water, or they say none. And you say, oh, look, there were actually two people in the furthest part of your zone. That's also the deepest part of your zone. Like, what else would you do in these situations? So it offers a lot of really great conversation starters for your team. The next one's bottom bias test. We talked a lot about bottom bias. So demonstrating why objects on the bottom are often missed. One of the things that my team always did is we would get in the actual water. We would do some lecture. We would get in the actual water and we would make different shapes, and we would all get in the highest guard stand. We would stand on the deck. We would sit on the deck. They weren't allowed to sit on the deck, but once in a while we'd catch them on the bleachers or moving one of the deck chairs over and sitting in it. So it just goes to reinforce all the reasons why we do the things that we do, but it also gives them an opportunity to see what different people, different objects, different bodies can look like in the water. It's really shocking for the first time that a lifeguard notices or kind of has that aha moment of realizing that a person can be at the bottom of the pool and it can look like it's an object and not even like a person. It's very jarring, and it's a really important teachable moment. And then stress layering. So we mentioned this a million times, but connecting stress and scanning quality. So adding in some different stressors and coming up with some different ways to do that while they're doing different types of skill can be really impactful. Like I mentioned, this will be recorded and we will send out the PowerPoint, and then you'll be able to kind of see that link to Ijari for some of the different points that I brought up that weren't already kind of those recognized best practices. This is the first time I've done this session, so I am really open to any feedback that you have. If there's anything that would have made it more actionable for you, please don't hesitate to let me know. I want to make sure that it lands how it's intended. So keep an eye out for the workbook and the recording. And feel free to reach out if I can answer any questions or provide you with any more resources as far as documentation goes or these concepts around scannings and audits. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.